Welcome, everyone, to the Brooklyn Rail's 1033rd New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Tess Lewis, Mira Rosenthal, and Richard Sieburth and Cole Swensen. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Tess Lewis is a translator from French and German. Her translations include works by Peter Handke, Walter Benjamin, Lutz Seiler, Philippe Jaccottet and Montaigne, a Guggenheim and Berlin Prize Fellow, as well as a scholar of note at the American Library in Paris. She serves as an advisory editor for the Hudson Review and has curated the Festival Neue Literature. Mira Rosenthal is the author of Territorial, a Pitt Poetry Series selection, and The Local World, winner of the Wyck Poetry Prize. Her translations of contemporary Polish poetry include Krystyna Dąbrowska's Tideline, which was shortlisted for the Derek Walcott Prize and the National Translation Award, and Tomasz Różycki's Colonies, which won the Northern California Book Award. Rosenthal's translation of Różycki's To the Letter is currently longlisted for the 2024 Griffin Poetry Prize. Richard Sieburth is Professor Emeritus of French and Comparative Literature at New York University. Sieburth is an authority on French Renaissance poetry, European Romanticism, and literary modernism, particularly on the life and work of Ezra Pound. In addition to his numerous editions of the work of Pound, he has published translations of Nostradamus, Maurice Sèvres, Frédéric Holderlin, Louise Labé, Charles Baudelaire, Louise Bourgeois, and others. And our host today, Cole Swensen, is the author of 17 volumes of poetry and a collection of critical essays, Noise That Stays Noise. Her book of hybrid poem essays, Art in Time, was published by Nightboat in 2021. A former Guggenheim Fellow, she has been a finalist for the National Book Award and has been awarded the Iowa Poetry Prize, the SF State Poetry Center Book Award, and the National Poetry Series. She has also translated over 20 volumes of poetry, prose, and art criticism from French and won the 2004 PEN USA Award in Literary Translation. And as with all of our publishing and transit programs, we'll start today with a reading. So I'll pass it over to Mira to get us started.
Thank you so much, Chloe and the Brooklyn Rail, for hosting this. I can't believe it's over 1,000 events that you've done in the new social environment. That's amazing. And I'm really happy to be in conversation with Cole and Tess and Richard today. I know we're going to have a lot of time for discussion, so I thought I wouldn't, I'm not going to introduce the poems as I sometimes do in readings. I just want to go ahead and read them for you, and then I'm happy to discuss further during our conversation. But these are poems from a book that just came out of Tomasz Różycki's poetry called To the Letter. And I believe Chloe will drop a few links. A few of the poems are available online if you want to follow along. Details. This is the story of my confusion. January, the lamppost wrapped in fog, spun cotton candy. Tonight, a thaw has come to this, our glacial land, and let out all the dead, who now crowd around me in great number at the kitchen table to pluck out these maggot letters that are squirming and flecking the wound. In light, the tablecloth, the paper, the fading glow of snow, the screen, in it a blizzard, make up a kind of field where letters go to glory. Can you read the world? Under snow lies proof of our cohabitation. I was consumed, was food for them, these letters that hatched inside me in a festering wound, in flesh, in mud, silt, waste. Life, as you know, is but a burning, eating, breaking down of organic matter into elementary bits, plus some details irrelevant to chemistry. My consultants. Due to the dawn and what's going on in this room, the question of the next election flies under the radar, and I see As you well know, how things get dark whenever we must choose from just a few of those who want to go and get themselves elected. I've seen things darkly ever since I started differentiating between words, taking that shadow color and placing it on a screen or on a piece of paper like a silhouette puppet of the hand. The matter of choice is consequently part of grammar, and certain tastes we need not even try to explain to ourselves. There's no need. An inner voice from nowhere. Intersecting coffee rings that circle words on a page are wiser than any vote cast today. If I endorse their choice, they'll establish a holiday for declaiming verses as alcohol is served. Why? Why did time begin? And when exactly was our separation? Where did this edict come from that life arises by subtracting things from a starting number, one of which is love? And why is time a number that knows only negative equations? Why does a cloud vanish behind the forest, beyond the window? Why but a flash of deer going past the train? Why finally does everything you want to keep go missing? What point is there to fire? Illumined faces circled round, if darkness soon replaces them, dismissed, doused. I'd like to donate all this memory to someone. Give away this enormous, chaotic force that comes on suddenly like a flood or stroke, marking the body with signs of oblivion, part statement, part fear, total paralysis. A glass. 5 days I polished the stones of the city with the soles of my shoes, where time likewise has honed trajectory and carved its name in footfall zigzags of an era, features of presence, body shape, a face in profile. Now seen from up above, the city's just a coin with which to buy a ticket from the conductor or one shot of espresso. I close the lids of my eyes, and the world still exists. Below the table, sparrows fight for a crust of bread, and kids on bikes race around the square, and from the open cathedral, silence emerges, stretches its spine in the sunlight. Even the colors are probably still bright there where they were, everything composed in signs of absence. Here on the table, I'll set this poem for you like an empty glass. So all you have to do is bring some wine to fill it. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And we'll pass it over to you, Richard.
Yes, well, I'm going to be reading from a book that's forthcoming from Archipelago, which will be entitled Wickerwork, and it's by a contemporary German poet born in Dresden in 1969, so a former Aussie, a former East German poet. And I'm going to read from the section of the book called, in German, Cherubinischer Staub, which is a title that comes out of Angelus Silesius's. He was a 17th century Baroque German poet, Cherubinischer Wandersmann. So it's a series of sort of wanderings of, let's say, a fallen angel, small little distichs. Leonard's working within the tradition of Baroque epigrammatic poetry, and these wanderings are around near where he lives, on the in Saxony, right on the Bohemian Czech border, in a region called the Osterzgebirge, the Eastern Ore Mountains. These were the mountains that were from which the immense wealth of Saxony in silver and tin was extracted from the Middle Ages on. And these poems are all dated and have specific place names, which I will omit. But they're all about the question of naming and renaming the world. And you'll notice what comes back again and again is this little rhythmic figure, this the name, a little dactyl kind of pattern. Hoarfrost, evening, a child's breath on black glass. This the name of the swan, stillness without mass. The final branching, the hair, the root sense. This the name of the elder shrub, my place of breath. Late fall, slope in flames, the sun no longer warming. This the name of oak leaves, eyelids in mourning. Back and forth of tides, you hear knocks in the ice. This the name of frost, sea skate, taking fright. Something buzzing in the tree, syllables for sure. This the name of embers, matter feeding words. You observe all the swallows and shadows growing dim. This the name of the first line, the sound you make, listening in. Storms sweeping around the house, noise pouring in. This the name of the future by night, free fall off the cliff. The tendrils on the walls, always identical in design. This the name of the future by day, a room with no sides. Morning's minion, the kite circles upward in the wind. This is the name of early day. We're all woven in. Lost like the leaves, those signatures we beseeched. This the name of red beach, summer shadows reach. The wings, raw from flapping, no longer know their reach. This the name of clouds lapping, tides with no beach. In the snow, the crows rock back and forth, cawing off key. This the name of the final leaf, sentences that don't agree. And here, I don't know if you can, Chloe, throw up the latest cover that Jill and I are in the process of designing for Wicker Work. This is sort of the title poem called Dragonfly. This is a sonnet. This dragonfly supplies me a key, a standstill comma in the sky, grass light streaming to her eye, hesitating where or what to be. Because such encounters, not of her making, because nothing explains what might follow, because our futures are so hollow, our wings so full, our eyes mistaken, how she thrums all out for herself, a gem punching above her weight, blue light nailing her into place. I see what she's looking at, myself, her limbs, pearls on strings. In her shimmer, summer again begins. And then this final poem, because Leonhard is also a theologian, a professor of the Institute for Liturgical Studies in Leipzig. Here's a little sort of poem of negative theology, apophatic theology. Der Gott, den es nicht gibt, in mir ein dunkler Riss, ist meine Seele nah, so oft ich ihn vermiss. God, who doesn't exist, in me a dark rift, so near my soul, whenever it's him I miss. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was beautiful. Both just really a great way to start the conversation. And I think we're going to segue now into a PowerPoint with some of the book covers that will give everyone a chance to talk about their practice and their work. So thank you, Chloe.
So I selected some of these titles because the titles I thought that were representative of Archipelago. I can speak a little bit about the sort of behind the curtain at the press because I've been on the board for over a decade. And so it's, Jill founded it in 2003, so it's 20 years old. They've published 230 books in 40 languages. I mean, it's just an amazing accomplishment. She's done all this pretty much relying on the goodwill of donors. And one of her main accomplishments is bringing classic works like Newcomers, the 2 volumes of Newcomers. This is one of the founding Slovenian works. It wasn't really Slovenia, and the Slovenian language was belatedly recognized as one worthy of hosting world literature, and this is one of those texts that is important. It chose this one because it's Karl Ove Knausgaard's first book, and it's an alternate angelology. It's completely different from his struggle, and one of the things that Archipelago did was really put him on the map. This, I think, is a fabulous book, and I would argue far better than his auto-fictional 6-volume My Struggle. Pick it up. It's fabulous. And then the next one, The Birds, is again one of a major work of Norwegian literature that few people outside, well, in the Anglosphere anywhere, know well enough. It's even Karl Ove Knausgaard says that this is one of the texts that was hugely important to him in his literary journey. And I hope that you're appreciating as Chloe goes through this slideshow, how beautiful the covers are. And here's another one where Jill will find an artwork that is stunning on its own, but then has a sort of an integral and very resonant relationship to the text. So this one I think is just fabulous. This is a madcap book that also you should put everything down and read, beautifully translated by Alison Waters, told from the perspective of a guard in a prehistoric cave, like the Lascaux caves in France. And he sets up, it becomes this insane discourse on who decides what is art and what is a classic. And this Art Brut illustration not only evokes this incredible character of a guard who has an enormous head, so large that his cap doesn't fit properly, and also the playfulness of the text. So pick up Éric Chevillard when you can. And here, Archipelago is also one of the first publishers to take Palestinian literature seriously. So Jill has brought out a number of Elias Khoury's books, and oh gosh, it's escaping me, the poet, Mahmoud Darwish as well. And so these 10, 15 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, she was already, there you have this phenomenal poet. She made this accessible to English readers at a time, again, when interest was even more lacking than it is today. And also, again, a beautiful conversation. And here, the standard format has become this an image set in a field. What the earlier books had the artwork more integrated in the cover, but it's still a recognizably Archipelago book. And here is the Brothers Grimm that I mentioned with one of the Haitian artists on the cover, but please pick up the book and leaf through it, and you'll see how there is it's really a counterpoint, both a complement and a counterpoint of this powerful, raw, earthy Haitian art with brutal fairy tales, quite frankly. And this one is mine. I will read from it at the end of the session. What I love about this cover. So this is its relation to the text. This is a book about the author Maja Haderlap's family, most of whom fought as partisans, Slovenian ethnic minority partisans in Carinthia, the southernmost province of Austria. And here we have a William Turner landscape called The Angel Troubles the Waters. So I had wanted Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, but Richard beat me to it. So we took this one, and the interesting thing about this series of watercolors by Turner is that he went on one of his grand tours, and so he sets the biblical stories in an alpine background. He was in Switzerland, but it'll do for Austria. And so it's a marvelous, again, a marvelous illustration of the text, but at a slight tangent. And the next one, this is another book that I translated with a Louise Bourgeois illustration. It's arguably a bit too direct, too obvious a connection to the text. But the interesting thing about this book, which is very difficult to read, it was certainly difficult to translate, and it's difficult to love, is also indicative of Jill's gift. And she decided to publish this challenging, unpleasant work because to her, this was a voice that needed to be heard. Christine Angot is arguably one of the early proponents of autofiction, and her books are very much autofictional, even though she rejects the label. And what she does in this book is, it's not graphic. It's far less graphic than you could say the Louise Bourgeois is. What she does is recreates the claustrophobic frame of mind that a survivor of incest has. And this was an urgent, what Jill felt was a very urgent sort of bearing witness that needed to be brought to English readers. Since then, there was oddly kind of a wave of testimonials from survivors of incest, fictionalized and real, that came shortly after this book. But I hope this gives a sense of the range, both visually and literarily, of Archipelago books over the last 20 years. And then another one that I will be reading from, Maja Haderlap, the Austrian writer, is a poet as well as a novelist. And here, Jill chose a Joseph Beuys watercolor. I never would have thought, I never would have named the artist looking at this, but since many of these poems are about the identity and the formation of a young women growing up in a patriarchal, repressive society like that of the Slovenian Corinthians. It's a beautiful illustration. And there we have the Angel of History, the famous Angelus Novus from Paul Klee.
Maybe I'll say something about this. I was very lucky. Translators rarely get a second act. This book was originally published by Peter Cole and Adina Hoffman in their Ibis editions out of Jerusalem. They then went out of business, and Jill picked this up, which enabled me to do revisions of the translations, and in fact write a brand new long afterword about angelology involving Benjamin and Scholom's and the whole background to this famous Paul Klee picture. The nice thing is that this is a bilingual edition of Scholom's German poems with my translations, and these poems do not exist in any German edition. So that is I think that that is a real coup to have a volume of German poetry by someone as important by Scholem that is not published anywhere in Germany yet. Next slide. This was the first book I did with Jill, whom I've known since, I think, 2001. I was very much involved in the initial founding of Archipelago back in 2003. And again, the special thing here is that I wanted to do a book that featured Michaud as much as a poet, as a visual artist. And if you can see, I mean, it's almost like a flip book, pages and pages of Michaud's, inspired ideograms with the text running in between. And I think very few publishers, unless specialized art publishers, would be able to give you this kind of rhythm of image and text. Beautiful job. Okay, this again is a book. This is a translation of a roman feuilleton, a newspaper novel published by Nerval during the brief life of the Second Republic in France. Here again, no other publisher could have given me exactly what I wanted. I went out and I was able to get reproductions of the original French newspaper publication, which ran this serial novel in various columns. In fact, 4 columns at the bottom, at the rez-de-chaussée of the page. Jill was able to give me this newspaper columnar layout. And on top of it, a thing that no publisher would do, I wanted to kind of further, as it were, foreignize the text. I wanted only the original French punctuation, which meant guillemets, which meant what Joyce calls French quotes. So all the punctuation is in fact following the original 19th century French customs of punctuation. And again, there is no edition of this book in French, no self-standing edition of this book in French, in paperback. It's in the big Pléiade. So onward. Emblems of Desire, again, I was given a second life. I was very unhappy with the way that UPenn Press initially laid this out. It was only in hardback. Jill acquired the rights and gave me exactly the layout that I wanted. Again, featuring the interplay of visual emblems and text, with the French text on top and the English text on bottom. Next. Another beautiful job that Jill did for me. This is not only Georg Büchner's bilingual text of Lentz, but I was also able to print bilingually the text by the Alsatian pastor Oberlin that Büchner sampled to create his text, and Goethe's own text about his friendship with Lentz. So it's a highly layered version of Lentz that again does not exist in any other language. And then this is finally what I'm just working on now, today as we speak, trying to figure out the very complex page layout of how these poems are going to work. I think not as an all-fuss translation, but as a almost interlinear top of the page, bottom of the page echo chamber of translations. I'm very, very happy. And I just wanted to say, I'm such a supporter of Archipelago that I have never asked a cent for anything that I have given to them. I felt that Jill should use this money to help other younger translators who are out there and who might not have had the comfortable academic salary that I benefited from.
And that's a perfect segue into me talking a little bit about the Polish list at Archipelago, but also my experience of feeling that Jill is really interested in supporting the next generation of translators and writers. I suppose I would fit more in that category. Here you have the cover of Pan Tadeusz, which was translated by Bill Johnston, amazing translator of Polish literature, who was my mentor in graduate school. And I thought I'd use this to talk a little bit about the kind of mentorship that I have found through the press in various ways, but also about the breadth of Jill's curiosity as an editor, which I so admire. Here we have a national epic, Pan Tadeusz, this epic romantic poem. So she's interested and willing to take on a book like this. But then if you go to the next slide, you see Bill's translation of a much more contemporary author, a treatise on shelling beans by Wiesław Myśliwski. And so I've always appreciated the range. And also, as someone said in the chat, the feel of the books. I think, Tess, you were talking about the look of the covers and how kind of iconic they are in that way that we can recognize an Archipelago book, but they also just feel good in the hands. And that's a really important thing for me. If you go, Chloe, a couple of slides ahead, I think you have To the Letter, which is my first book with Archipelago. And I just wanted to mention also how wonderful the editorial process has been. Not only the visual eye, here we were looking for an image that would somehow, as you said, Tess, that illustrates the book, but at a slight angle. Here, the birds for us were the kind of a take on typeface and letters that in the book start taking over the speaker. As you heard in some of the poems, they kind of are these flecks that get into the wounds of the speaker. And also in the book, the speaker's playing around with the fact that in Polish, you have diacritic marks. So the diacritic marks as well become activated and are these kind of animalistic element in the way that the speaker's experiencing language. I also really enjoyed trying to come up with a title for the book with Jill. The Polish title is simply Litery, which means letters. And yeah, we could have used letters, but I think for the American reader, our first thought is letters like you would send to someone in the mail. And so along with Jill, we came up with a slight variation on the Polish, which I think brings in this interesting exactitude, this theme of exactitude, which works well with the poems. If you go to the next slide, I also wanted to just mention Archipelago in the world. I just came off of a book tour with the author Tomasz Ruzicki that Archipelago helped to set up. And Archipelago is so well connected with the world of translation. Nationally, we had an event. This is an event that you're seeing at New York University, but we also read at the Center for the Art of Translation in San Francisco, and as well at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. And if you go on to some of those pictures, the reason why I wanted to put these in here is because they show young people smiling, reacting to translated literature, translated poetry from Polish of all languages. And for a lot of the students that we interacted with, this was really their first time meeting a poet from another country, thinking about the mediation that translation requires. Suddenly, I could see light bulbs going off of, oh, I've read works of literature in translation and never talked about the translated status of the text. And so I think this is, Archipelago is not only a great activist in trying to address the fact that it's only 3% of literature that exists in translation every year. Only 3% of books is work in translation. And then if you look at the literary works, it's even less. And so they're addressing that, but they're also fostering the next generation and fostering the next generation of readers of literature and translation. So there are just so many ways that I am deeply indebted to the work that Archipelago does, and just elated to be able to share one of their books through my work.
Does someone want to tell us a little bit about Elsewhere? Tess, you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. About 3 or 4 years ago, Jill decided to extend this visual sense and the joy that Mira just mentioned to younger readers, or even pre-readers. I think there's one book that has very few, if any, words at all. And she started Elsewhere Editions, which is a series of a line of children's books in translation with the same production values that she gives to her covers. And so these books are just, they're such a joy to look at, to hold, to read. It's they're truly fabulous, not, the sort of simplified, easy access books that you can sometimes find in children's bookstores. These books take children seriously as readers and as observers and thinkers. So it's quite an accomplishment to have founded a parallel series of equal quality to her main adult literature line. It's funny, there's several themes that have come up, as Richard and Mira have spoken as well. And I once gave a laudation for Jill, who had won the Friedrich Olfers Prize for her services to German language literature. And what I said about her was that it takes more than 6 senses to create a list like Archipelagos. We've got Jill's eye, which I think is more than evident in this slideshow. There's her sense of touch, which has been commented on in the chat. She always uses very high quality paper, beautiful typeface, a clean design with plenty of white space for the words to breathe. There's her ear. She manages to hear the authors, the various authors' voices, even languages she doesn't speak. She's one of the most sort of intuitively gifted editors that I've ever worked for. She does have quite a red pen, but it's a collaborative one. It's never to be feared. There's her taste, which is as wide as these books show, but even wider. There are so many books that we could have talked about. I wasn't quite sure what to do with the sense of smell, but used books always smell good. So I'm sure that after these books go through several readers' hands, they're as intriguingly olfactorily as they are visually. And finally, the sixth sense is her intuition. You know, whether it's for a children's book or another book, an adult book whose language she doesn't have access to. And finally, I suppose her seventh sense would be her curiosity and her openness to the outside world. What we haven't talked about, and there's probably not time to go into it, is that Jill has also done a series called Imagine Africa, which are beautifully produced anthologies of African literature. I think she's done 3 so far. So, you know, there's just so many elements that go into creating a press and a list like Archipelago, and I'm glad to have my enthusiasm echoed on so many fronts.
I'd like to add just a little personal note to that. This last Christian Leonhardt volume, and this I think is rather rare, is something that Jill brought to me. She had been, I guess, at the Frankfurt Book Fair and talking to the Surkamp people, and sort of had them send me the PDFs of these 2 recent volumes. I had never, frankly, heard of Christian Leonhardt. She just saw it and figured this was the kind of poet that would speak to me, and as it were, commissioned it. And I'm very grateful for that, because this does not happen that often in the translation world. You all know how one often has to go out and peddle one's wares. So for projects to come to you, you know, on the part of the publisher is very rewarding indeed.
Great. That's actually a perfect segue into the first question I was going to ask. But also, first, thank you all so much for giving us such a great background on the press, its range, its tactility, all those things was really helpful. But I wanted to ask you all, as translators who all cover a really great range, how do you choose your projects? Why do you choose a certain book? Is it to read it more deeply, to understand it more fully, just to spend joyous time with it? Or do you get asked to do things by either editors or others? So maybe we'll just start with you, Mira, and let us know how that comes about.
Yeah. So there's a range of ways that I choose my books. For Tomasz Ruzicki, he was the first poet who I translated over 2 decades now. So we've been working together for quite a while. And his voice is very easy for me to drop into. I think fundamentally, I choose to translate in general because it's a way of learning things that perhaps I want to do as a poet, or that I don't yet know how to do as a poet. I think with his work, there was an affinity in our interests thematically with patterns. And there was a music that I heard in his language that I wanted to study more. Since then, at that time, I also made a commitment to translating contemporary authors who weren't yet in English. I really wanted to try to introduce more voices rather than, you know, stake my name as a translator, translating the greats. And so I'm always on the lookout for new poets, new voices. A number of years ago, I also decided to really seek out female identifying voices, because in the world of translation, there's a great discrepancy in terms of gender and who's thought of as worthy to be translated into English. Hence we have our Women in Translation Month. And so that's how I came to Kristina Dombrovska's work, which was a co-translation with 2 other translators. And now I'm also translating the work of a poet, Małgorzata Lebda, who I was drawn to as in addition because she is really focused on ecology. And she's got really interesting ways that she's this eco-poetic voice. In my world, I would think that we're in this globally together, and thus we need to hear a cacophony of voices from around the globe talking about our environmental crisis right now. So yeah, those are just some of the ways that I come to some projects.
Great, thank you. How about you, Tess?
It's a mix now. Of course, at the beginning, like I'm sure 90% of all translators, I really had to go out and, send pitches and try to convince editors to just read them, much less accept them. There were a couple books I sent out to more than 24 presses. But now, fortunately, I have writers that for whom I've done multiple books, and editors are more inclined to think of me than my having to pitch them, but which is a relief because it is just so much work. What got me into translation, and I think what really that's what sustains me, is not just a desire to share my enthusiasm for a certain work, but when you do translate something and engage with the text on a word by word basis, a really granular level, but also, the bird's eye view of it, you understand how it's put together and how effective it is and why those effects are so powerful in a way that you don't just reading a book, no matter how many times you read it. So that's really what I take joy in, even in the long stretches of a book. And every book, even short ones, have their long stretches.
Great, thank you. And Richard, tell us a bit more about how other books got chosen for you.
Well, this may sound a little pretentious, but sort of as a poundling, I've really been interested in sort of excavating the tradition of the new, the emergence of the modern. So going back, I've translated troubadour poetry via Jacques Roubaud. I translated a Tyrolean troubadour poet, Oswald von Wolkenstein. Then I got interested in sort of the site of the emergence of the new in 16th century Lyon, translating Nostradamus and Maurice Sèvres and Louise Labbé. A lot of my translations have a relationship to living in imaginary spaces, and certainly Provence was one place. I did an edition of Ezra Pound's 1912 walking tour through southern France. Lyon was another place. And then moving over into German, sort of doing a kind of excavation of the German new with Hölderlin, which allowed me to inhabit Swabia and Tübingen for a while, and then Büchner's Lenz, which involved me living in the threshold area of Strasbourg, where Büchner was deeply implicated. And then, of course, 19th century Paris with my translations of Nerval and Baudelaire and Mallarmé, and turn of the century, emergence of the avant-garde. I have another volume coming forth with Archipelago around Sandrars's Easter in New York, with his unpublished, untranslated into English, notebooks of his 1911-12 stay in New York. And then via my interest in literary theory, Benjamin, Passagenwerk a bit, Convolut N, his Moscow diary, living with Benjamin in Moscow in the late 20s with Asya Lassis. And then the relationship to contemporary poets. I did a Jacques Darras with World Poetry and Translation, had a friendship and long conversation with Darras, and now with my new poet theologian friend in former East Germany, Lehnhardt. So that's I'm realizing as I look back over my very long career, sort of what has informed what seemed to be just a series of arbitrary arbitrary decisions at the moment.
Great, thank you. And actually, again, you have given me the perfect segue into the next question I was going to ask, which is the relationship between translation and location. Do you find, and this is a question for you all, that it's helpful to be in the city or the country, or at least a country that speaks the language that you're translating? Or are there other atmospheric? Does it help to be away at a writer's residency? Or is it best to be in your own study where you feel very grounded? What does location have to do with your translation practice? And maybe Tess will start with you this time. And
Sure. I find it extremely rewarding, and in fact, essential to go to the places where the places I'm translating from, as it were. And the reason for that is that I translate from French and German, but actually I'm most interested in Swiss, Austrian, and the Swiss and Austrian, both Swiss, French, and German, and the Austrian German. And so by spending time in those places, you understand, you get a better feel for the variance in language and the rhythms and what it means. I mean, I've translated plenty of Germans, and it's important to be there too. I have a book coming out with New York Review in the fall by Lutz Seiler called Star 111, and it's set in Berlin between the fall of the wall and reunification. And going there and, walking in his traces and seeing the places where he squatted and, that he writes about, and the whole scene, which has practically disappeared now, but getting a geographical sense of that was important. And also shadings of difference between East German and West German in the 80s and 90s was also important. And going to these places is the best way to do that. Also, seeing a landscape and understanding how that is, both how it can influence the writing and what the writers are talking about. If they describe a landscape at all metaphorically and you don't know what they're talking about, it makes it very difficult to pin it down in English words.
yeah. Yeah.
And then about the residencies, I've found that very valuable, because some of the books that I've loved most working on and translating were suggested by translators of completely different language pairs, but when they had an enthusiasm and told me about it and I looked into it, often I was able to champion that book into English later.
Great, thanks. And Mira, who is currently at a residency in Switzerland?
Yes, I'm currently at a residency, and I rely on them so much because I need the time. I am a full-time professor as well, and a mother and a person. And there's always that challenge of finding time, not only for my writing of my poems, but for translating poems. And the kind of space a residency provides allows that very close, as Tess was saying, granular level that is essential. For me, I find residencies are for translation are really great at the beginning of the translation project. For my writing of my poems, they're better once I already have a project in mind and kind of halfway through it. And of course, going to Poland, having a feel for the language, existing within the rhythms of the language. Krystyna Dąbrowska writes mostly about elsewhere. She travels a lot and spends probably a good half of the year away from Poland. And so it's a different type of imagining or sensing out, feeling out what's in her chest as a poet and how that's getting expressed through her Polish. The book that I'm working on now by Małgorzata Lebda came out of a trip that she took. She decided to run the entire length of the Wisła River from the mountains in the Beskid Mountains where she grew up all the way to its source at the Baltic Sea. I will not be doing that trip as well. My knees will not withstand it. But she documented the trip in a magazine called Pismo. And so I have her prose accounting of her experience. And that, I think, that kind of embodiedness, that desire to run not as an athlete, but as a poet, I'm really interested in how to embody that through the translation. I suppose the last thing I would say, I like this question about location, because for me, the act of writing is an embodied experience. The act of poetry isn't first and foremost an embodied experience. It's putting us into our bodies. So rhythm is crucial. Richard, I loved hearing you talk a little bit about the dactylic rhythm of some of the poems that you were reading, and hearing the strong rhythm and the rhyme. You know, all of that is about location and embodiment.
Thanks for that. Great. And Richard, do you want to add anything to your sense of location and how it affects things?
Well, yeah, as they say in real estate, location, location, location. But I think translation is also, even at a deeper level, about the art of dislocation and disembodiment. I personally, just from personal history, have really never had any sense of anywhere being home. So translation is just a way of going on and dealing with being elsewhere and dealing with being someone else.
Well put. Thank you. Before we segue into questions and answers, I just want to touch briefly on the program test that you were involved in at the American University in Paris about a month ago, the Translation Slam with Daniel Levenbecker. And I wondered if you could briefly talk about that and talk about translation as performance.
Yeah, I mean, the translation slams can take several different formats. It's interestingly, it is the one event at Penn World Voices that always sells out immediately. People just love going to the translation slams. That format is a bit more spontaneous. Sometimes the translators often they prepare the text in advance, but not always. For the one that I did at the American the American Library in Paris, we were given a text that was very, it turned on wordplay throughout it was an anecdote that was basically built around wordplay. So it was very difficult. And I tried my best to find equivalents. I stayed pretty close. I might have gone rogue, because knowing that it wasn't for publication, it was more as an exercise. Daniel Levenbecker did go rogue and completely changed the metaphors, kept them consistent within themselves. But, for example, one of the guiding puns was Montagne Russe, Russian mountains, which means roller coaster. And he changed that into Swiss cheese and did a whole, he did the variations. He rang the changes on Swiss cheese that the author did on the Russian mountains roller coaster thing. And so it was, what made it such a fun evening was that these were two valid translations that were utterly different. Now, he may not have done that if he were working on a book. I don't know. He's a quite inventive translator, but it was a great way to illustrate live how there is no one correct translation. There are certainly wrong translations, but there's no one final definitive translation. Another way to make the translator present that I've witnessed was at the Solothurn Book Festival in Switzerland every year. Well, not every year, but for several years in a row, they had an event or a series of events called the Transparent Translator. And so you would sit in a room with the original and your work up on a screen and translate, and the audience would come by and comment, and you had to you had to have a thick skin. The comments were not always given very charitably, but I think it did also raise the awareness of how many decisions go into the word choice. So it's easy for somebody coming by and say, well, why are you using, apple when it's obviously a pear? But, given the different themes that might have been developed, apple may be actually more suitable for the instance, the particular instance. So those are two ways that I've found it effective to bring readers into the lives of translators and translators into the lives of readers.
Just like to comment on translation as performance. I often like to use the French word interprète, which of course means an interpreter, but it also means a performer and a translator. So the French word gets all three of these dimensions: the hermeneutic, the performative, and the translational, all into one word.
You're muted, Cole.
Sorry. Anything you want to add, Mira?
I love using translation multiples whenever I can. That's for me the best way to get a glimpse into really what's happening through the process of translation, is to have multiple versions of the same poem or the same text, because there are always other options. And there's always a whole list of things that a translator is negotiating. So as Tess was saying, maybe there's a reason why you translated pear as apple. Sound, metaphoric system, whatever it might be. Those choices become so much more apparent when you have multiple versions that you can compare. I sometimes do translation slams with my translation students and workshops, and it brings a kind of joy and levity and releases some of their anxiety about making a mistake.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, all three of you. These were just great ideas and great details that came out. And also, many thanks to Jill Schoolman and all the amazing work she's done with Archipelago. So we will now hand it over to Chloe and have comments and questions from people listening.
Wow. First of all, thank you so much, Tess, Mira, Richard, and Cole for that dialogue, which was incredibly generous and illuminating, and such a lovely conversation to listen to. We have several questions from the audience, and the first one will be from our friend GE. GE, I'll give you the chance to unmute.
Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you, panel, and thank you, Archipelago Books. When I think of Archipelago books, I always think of the word visionary. How would anybody want to answer this? Maybe one or all. How do you define visionary, and how do you set your sights to find the visionary?
Well, I would reply actually etymologically. It starts with the visual. And I think we've all been talking about in terms of the covers, in terms of the typography, in terms of the dimensions of the book. They put us in a visual field um, that begins to vibrate in such a way that it carries us up and out into what we might call the visionary. But I personally always like to ground the visionary in the visual, as many great mystics have, whether it's Jakob Böhm seeing God in the reflection of his pewter off his pewter plate. Well, it starts with the minute particulars of the vision of the visual that are then intensified.
Thanks. Anybody else want to contribute to that, round it out?
I mean, I would say that Archipelago has a visionary element also in the content of the text, certainly visually. There's no doubt about that. Somehow Jill is able to intuit works that will be important, that are important perhaps where they've come from, but that will have import for an English language readership. I mean, I can speak to Angel of Oblivion as an example. Now, this novel tells a chapter in European 20th century history that was overlooked for a very long time, even in Austria. In fact, they really did whitewash history, where children were taught up until 1938. Then there was nothing, and it started again in 45 or 46 in the history textbooks in schools. And the way the Slovenian minority was treated was not known to younger generations, even in Slovenia. And so it has changed, this novel has changed the conversation about the recent past and the way Austrians face the past in Austria. But its import for the United States or Britain is, how do we live with minorities that, say, predate the nation state, or that are a bit a thorn in the side because of their competing demands and interests? How do we integrate them? A democracy really, one can evaluate a democracy by the way it treats its most vulnerable citizens. And this is a book that shows that in real time. And I think that is a way of thinking about texts that are visionary and political without being simplistic. Political in a way that can be applied to many situations and countries.
Thank you so much for that question, GE, and thank you, Richard and Tess, for your answers. The next question today is from Armin. Armin, I'll give you the chance to unmute, I suppose.
Well, I addressed my question to Richard, and he actually answered it in the chat. And it was a very specific question, had to do with the, but I do have a comment on it in general, the use of the French translation in the Nerval novel, how keeping French translation, French punctuation worked in the English, because the French punctuate quite differently, typically, usually a lot more commas, for instance. And he kind of answered and said something very interesting, which was that it made it stranger or estranged. And this raises that entire question about how strange do you keep a translation in English in the with the mind in mind, keeping in mind that you want to convey that this is a book originally written in a different language, not written in English. It is really an old question, but I think that something that every translator thinks about. And so Richard answered in a way that to me was very interesting, to make something a little strange. Do you want to elaborate any more, Richard?
Well, I mean, you know, if you want to talk about the recent developments in, or not so recent now, translation studies, translation theory,
Domestication.
associated, of course, with my old friend Larry Venuti,
Right.
the tension between domestication
Foreignization.
or naturalization and foreignization. And I mean, this is a debate that goes through the history of translation.
Absolutely.
The literalists back in the Renaissance were called Dutch translators, which usually meant German. So I mean, there's still a kind of there's kind of been a kind of a backlash against the exemplified, let's say, by the French tradition of naturalizing the foreign, of domesticating it, as opposed to the Schleiermacher German tradition, which is not to move the text close to the reader, but to move the reader into the strangeness, into the foreignness of the text. And Antoine Berman, who's one of my favorite writers on the history and theory of translation, talks about l'épreuve de l'étranger, the proof or the trial, or the ordeal of the foreign, that you must move into the foreign in order to return back to the native, which is, kind of the argument of Hegel's phenomenology and of much of Hölderlin's poetry. So, but it's still there. I mean, you look at the Pevere
Larissa
translations from the Russian that strive for a kind of a strange literalism that, and then there are the people who, no, let's go, Constant Garnett does it better.
Right.
Lydia Davis is a very, very interesting example
Yes.
of someone who took on Proust in this fashion.
Right.
Generating a very interesting Beckettian kind of Proust that was, slammed in the New York Review by conservatives like Andre Aciman. So, I mean, it remains I think, a vital debate, and I'm not sure that you have to kind of programmatically either domesticate or estrange. I mean, in the case of this Nerval, I really wanted to present it as a kind of historical artifact. So therefore, with the typography of the period, and actually the punctuation in English, to see guillemets in English, carrots, double carrots, is kind of fun, and it actually, while estranging the text, freshens it up. You're looking at this foreign object in sort of a different way. But I would hesitate to say you need to, programmatically go either way. I think every translation demands a very singular and strategic encounter, and I'm very, very very, very suspicious of ideologues like Venuti.
Yeah, I would second that conclusion that, there's so many ways that the foreign element comes into any translation that I do. that comes with names, that comes with the diacritics, that comes with so many cultural references that I want to have there to give that sense that this is not an American author. Interestingly, for me, there's also poet-specific moments where I have to think about domestication versus foreignization. For Ruzhitsky, that has to do with listing. So many editors want me to break up his lists, but that is this key element that even in the Polish is a foreignizing quality, even for Polish readers. Also, meter and rhyme. So many editors want me to get rid of meter and rhyme because contemporary American poetry, you know, you have a certain sense of rhyme that, you know, we don't want too much rhyme in there, too many chimes. And I lean fully into the meter and rhyme because, again, it's a mark, it's an element of this particular poetry. Certainly there's other ways that I domesticate. And for me, in the translations that I do, but also when I read a translation, I love having a translator's afterword or forward to give me a sense of what they were thinking about in that process. To know what a translator's, any particular translator's priorities were, will tell me that tells me how they're domesticating, and that helps me then use that in my reading of the text they're presenting me.
There's a shorthand way of thinking about this as well, a slogan that's sort of been making the rounds recently, and that is, don't translate punctuation, punctuate your translation. Because there are plenty of authors who use punctuation in an idiosyncratic way that doesn't follow their language's conventions. And if you standardize that, then you lose something. I translated a Swiss author, Ludwig Hohl, who used punctuation almost in a choreographic way to regulate the pauses between his endless series of clauses, and to show which ones were primary and secondary in importance. So it's slogans are slogans, but that one I find thought-provoking.
On punctuation, interesting. I had a correspondence with Lydia Davis, who's an old friend, while she was translating her Madame Bovary, and she's a pretty rigorous literalist, down even to punctuation. But we had a long she said, Flaubert uses all these exclamation marks, and they were much more frequent in 19th century prose, and she decided in the end, despite her vows of fidelity, that a number of these exclamation marks just wouldn't work in English. So I mean, actually, the deep work, I think you're absolutely right, of translation does involve punctuation. In the full sense of what that means, logically, as breath marks or whatever.
Thank you so much to all of you for those answers, and thank you, Armin, for that incredibly generative question. The last question today, first of all, I want to thank everyone for your questions. We won't be able to get to everyone's today, but the last one that we'll take today is from Odile. Odile, I'll give you the chance to unmute.
Oh, thank you so much, and congratulations to everyone. And yeah, Archipelago is a wonderful, just a wonderful project. I remember, I'm actually a personal friend of Jill, so I remember the days when Archipelago was just a conversation we were having, and back in New York in the early 2000s, I guess. And I'm a great admirer also of Richard, of course, my former professor at NYU. And I wanted to ask a question about when you feel that a translation is done. So I've been working on translation for about over a decade. I'm so, embarrassed to say that, but it's an incredibly difficult book. It's, I don't know if you can see, Galaxias by Haroldo de Campos, experimental text, very Joycean. It's gone through a number of different, processes, and I even lost the manuscript originally that I had, and I had to reconstruct it. But my question is, so even now at the proof stage, I see things that I like, oh no, that, I have to change it. How and when, and how do you know that a translation is done? Thank you.
Odile, it's never done. It's never done. We are condemned to this, revisionary ratio, as Bloom would call it. It is never done. Live with it.
Yeah, my answer would be the same. It's never done. But I also think, I think about my relationship with the writing of my own poems, that I look back at my previous books and I think, oh, I would never write that poem in that way now. I think similarly, I look back at some of my old translations and I think, oh, I would never translate that poem in the same way now. So we're always changing as writers, as human beings, and growing in our sense of the lenses we bring to what we're reading and interpreting, and through the act of writing my own poems, which I think of as an act of translation as well. And so maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing. Each book is kind of one marker of one point of how you hear the language and hear the poems.
I would just, a translation is never done, but there's a lovely movie called The Woman with Five Elephants about a translator from Russian. The Five Elephants are the big Russian books, War and Peace, Brothers Karamazov, etc. And over the course of her life, she translates and then, God help her, retranslates them into German. Sorry.
That was such a great last question. Cole, do you have an answer for your own translations?
Well, just briefly, I would say I've always been puzzled by the fact that a translation is never done. I could always keep on working on it. But for me, a poem does have a moment when it's done. And I know, okay, I'm not going to change a word. Now it's right. And I never get to there with a translation.
Thank you all so much. And thank you everyone for your questions today. We're going to conclude today with a reading from Tess. And so I'll pass it back over to Tess.
Thank you. I am going to read from Angel of Oblivion and from Distant Transit. So Maja Haderlap's novel first, to show how lyrical her prose is, and then just two short poems from Distant Transit, because they deal with the same themes of minority languages in the shadow of a larger one, a culture in the shadow of a larger one, a country at war. So this is the section I'm reading is about the after effects of the war on how it lasted for generations, the damage done. The war is a devious fisher of men. It cast out its net for the adults and trapped them with its fragments of death, its debris of memory. Just one careless act, one brief moment of inattention, and it pulls in its net. Father is immediately snagged on memory's hooks. He's already running for his life, trying to escape the war's omnipotence. The war suddenly looms in hastily spoken sentences, strikes out from the shelter of darkness. It leaves its captives trembling in its net and withdraws for months at a time to prepare a fresh attack as soon as it's forgotten. If ever it grows feeble, they welcome it into their homes and smile at its armor, certain they can win it over. They set a place at the table, make up a bed for it. Father was the youngest partisan. His cousin Peter tells us when we're gathered in the sitting room to celebrate grandmother's birthday. The youngest partisan, do you still remember? You were barely 12 years old. Yes, father says, but he'd much rather forget all about it. At night, he sometimes wakes with a start and has no idea where he is. In my dreams, I'm still running for my life like I did back then on the Velika Planina, father says. Mother of God, the others say. Now that was a dog's life. The day our provisions ran out and the commando came, it was up and out, down the mountain, through the German soldiers, over, out. That was some kind of noise, father recalled. At 2 a.m, they slid down the mountainside in deep snow, down a chute that was used to send trees into the valley below. The Germans trained searchlights up from Kamnik. It was so bright, every movement was visible. There was shooting in the valley, and all you could see were red and blue streaks. Leaves and branches rained down from the trees, and one partisan was lying on the ground yelling, help me, father tells us. But he just ran as if the devil were on his heels. They'd gotten separated while escaping. He and 2 other partisans ran across the road and right in front of a German soldier with a machine gun. I'm a dead man, father told himself. Now I'm going to get shot. But the German made it clear he should disappear. He waved father on. Quick, quick, the soldier said. He was a good one, father says, one of the good ones. I'll never forget him. Father's group reached the river and the commander yelled, cross through the water, we'll never make it over the bridge. The first one who stepped in the river vanished, washed away like nothing. They'd clung to each other and made it across. The water rushed over him and his brother, and this in January. Because in war, it's like being hares in a hunt. Only much worse, father says. Yes, Peter confirmed, we were the hares and hunger was our commander. And from Distant Transit, Maja initially wrote all her poems in Slovenian, and this is the first volume that she wrote in German. And just in terms of translations never being finished and rewriting originals and rewriting translations, she does not translate herself, even though she could, because she wants to resist the temptation to fix or change her originals. So this poem from Distant Transit is called Dreaming Language. My small tongue dreams up a land where it builds nests of words to swarm out over the borders that are not its own. It wants to outgrow itself, to glide through distant spirit paths of water or gas, to dive down to deep sea vents, to have a term for every phenomenon and its dubious shadows, to inhabit those who speak and write it as a shimmering population of words, to lay its larvae in their pores. My language wants to be unbridled and large. It wants to leave behind the fears that occupy it. All those stories, dark and bright, in which its worth and weight is questioned. Only when it dreams does it soar, supple and light, by its very nature, merely song. And I'd like to end with this poem called Translation, because it, while ending this conversation, I feel that it opens up so many others. Translation. Is there a zone of darkness between all languages, a black river that swallows words and stories and transforms them? Here, sentences must disrobe, begin to roam, learn to swim, not lose the memory that nests in their bodies, a secret nucleus. Will the columbine's blue be a shade of violet when it reaches the other side, and the red bee balm become a pear, cinnamon sweet? Will my tench be missing a fin in the light of this new language? Will it have to learn to crawl or to walk upright? Does language know how to draw another toward it, or only how to turn the other one away? Can each word then risk the transit, believe itself invulnerable, dipped in pitch and hard as steel? Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you all so much for the wonderful conversation. And thank you to Chloe and to Eleanor and the Rail in general and to Fong Bui for giving us the opportunity.
Thank you all so much, Tess. That was such a beautiful reading. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you, of course, as well to the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support the Rails archive on our YouTube channel, where this video will be posted shortly and where I hope you'll be able to rewatch some of it. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Gia Yigu, Chloe Flores, and Alyssa Walker on the occasion of Valley Export Embodied at the Mack Center in Los Angeles. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for being here in this space with us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
you.
That's
Everyone.
really
Thank
beautiful. Thank you. Thank you
Bye.
for the readings,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for the great
Bye.
conversation.